Many people believe that infidelity begins with a clear, deliberate decision, as if a person sits with themselves at a certain moment and chooses to betray their partner. However, the psychological reality is often far more complex than that. In many cases, a person does not initially see themselves as unfaithful, even after they have already crossed the boundaries of the relationship. Instead, it often begins with a series of small justifications that make them feel that what they are doing is understandable, justified, or even deserved. You might hear a woman confidently say, "I could never cheat on my husband." Yet later, she may find herself emotionally involved with someone else, exchanging daily messages and sharing her deepest thoughts and feelings. When confronted with the situation, she may not describe it as infidelity, but rather as a natural outcome of certain circumstances she went through. Rather than viewing her actions as personal choices, she may begin to reshape the story in her mind in a way that reduces guilt. She may tell herself that the other person understood her better, gave her the attention she had been missing for years, or listened to her when no one else did. Here emerges an important psychological reality. Human beings generally do not like to see themselves in a negative light. Therefore, when someone acts in a way that conflicts with their values or principles, the mind tries to construct an explanation that allows them to live with this inner contradiction. For this reason, many cases of infidelity do not begin with the thought, "I want to cheat," but rather with feelings such as, "I deserve to be happy," or "I am no longer getting what I need from my relationship," or "this just happened unintentionally." Over time, these justifications evolve into a complete narrative that allows the person to see themselves more as a victim of circumstances than as someone responsible for their choices. In this video, we will explore 7 common psychological ways some women use to justify infidelity to themselves. Some of these justifications may seem logical at first glance, while others are more subtle and complex, but they all serve the same function: reducing guilt and maintaining a positive self-image. What is most interesting is that the most dangerous of these justifications is not the most obvious, but the quietest and most subtle. It allows a person to continue their behavior for a long time while still firmly believing, deep down, that they have done nothing wrong and remain a good and faithful partner in their own eyes. The first method: "He doesn't understand me." One of the most common justifications across time and different cultures is a phrase that may seem simple on the surface, but carries a deep emotional layer of rationalization. "My husband doesn't understand me." In this internal narrative, the relationship is no longer viewed as a partnership built on mutual responsibilities. Instead, it is reduced to a single idea: emotional understanding. As if everything the husband provides, financial support, daily responsibilities, or enduring life's pressures, loses its value if it is not accompanied by a constant ability to read emotions and interpret unspoken signals. It often begins with an internal feeling of dissatisfaction, which gradually turns into a conviction that the other person cannot understand. At this stage, the discussion is no longer about communication or improving the relationship. Instead, the mind begins to search for an alternative solution: someone else who truly understands me. Meanwhile, a new person may appear in one's daily life or social circle, seeming more attentive, more present, and more emotionally responsive. This is not necessarily because he is fundamentally different, but because the interaction is still in its early stage, where attention is intense, listening is active, and impressions are positive and not yet shaped by the weight of daily life. This creates an unfair comparison: a long-term relationship filled with responsibilities and pressures versus a new, light, and emotionally stimulating connection. The conclusion in the mind then feels obvious: he doesn't understand me, but the other person does without effort. What is often overlooked in this comparison is that understanding is not a fixed state, but a mutual process that requires time, effort, and patience from both sides. It is also ignored that new relationships often appear ideal in their early stages, when each person is presenting their best self, while the real complexities only emerge over time. This type of justification can gradually form a comforting internal narrative, allowing the person to see themselves not as responsible for what is happening, but as a victim of emotional neglect. In this way, emotional detachment is reframed as a search for emotional safety or spiritual connection, rather than a crossing of relational boundaries. Ultimately, The essence of this justification does not lie in the absence of understanding itself, but in how it is interpreted and how a simple concept like being understood can be transformed into a complex psychological excuse for decisions that are far more significant than they initially appear. The second method, he has changed. He has become a different person. This argument often appears when emotional distance begins to develop within a relationship, where all the natural changes that occur in married life are reduced to a single idea: he is no longer the same as before. In this narrative, the early stage of the relationship is recalled: the man who paid attention to small details, sent kind messages, showed high levels of romance, and maintained constant emotional attentiveness. That phase is then compared to a later, more realistic stage, where responsibilities overlap, work pressure increases, and daily life becomes more stable and less emotionally intense. At this point, this natural transition is interpreted as a change in essence, as if the person's entire character has shifted, rather than recognizing that circumstances themselves have simply evolved. The phrase, "he is not the man I used to know," is then used, as if early romance was the permanent baseline rather than a temporary stage of the relationship. On the other hand, a new person in the social environment may appear more lighthearted, more emotionally expressive, and more attentive in communication. However, this impression is often not the result of a fundamental personality difference, but rather because the relationship is still in its early phase, where there are no heavy responsibilities or complex daily pressures yet. Thus begins an unbalanced comparison: a long-term relationship that has gone through multiple stages of stability, stress, and real-life complexity, versus a new relationship still in its first impressions stage, where everything appears simpler and clearer. What is often overlooked is that relationships are not measured by the consistency of early emotions, but by their ability to endure and adapt to changing circumstances. The transition from emotional intensity to responsibility does not necessarily mean a loss of care, but rather a transformation in its form and expression. Nevertheless, the internal narrative may be reshaped in a way that makes emotional withdrawal easier to justify, by focusing on the idea that he has completely changed, rather than acknowledging that the relationship itself has simply entered a different stage. In this way, the interpretation becomes a psychological tool for simplifying a far more complex reality, reducing everything to a comforting phrase: "he is not the same anymore," even though the truth is often far deeper than that. The third method, "we are going through a crisis in our relationship." The phrase, "we are going through a crisis in our relationship," is often used when tension begins to surface in married life, as if the relationship has suddenly entered an emergency phase caused by external forces, without any clear internal buildup or context. In this narrative, what is happening is framed as a temporary exceptional situation: frequent arguments, ongoing misunderstandings, and growing emotional distance. Then, a new person may appear who seems to revive emotions and provide a different sense of emotional presence and connection. However, what is labeled as a crisis is often not a sudden or external event, but rather the result of long-term accumulation of tension, poor communication, and repeated negative interactions within the relationship itself. Over time, these build up into a general sense of dissatisfaction that is eventually summarized in a single word: crisis. At this stage, mutual frustration or emotional withdrawal may be interpreted as proof that the relationship is ending, rather than as a signal that both partners need to restore balance and improve communication. This creates an indirect comparison between a complex, long-term marital reality and a new, emotionally light experience that has not yet faced real-life pressures. In new relationships, everything initially appears smoother, attention is constant, listening is active, and emotional space feels open. However, this impression does not necessarily reflect long-term compatibility, but rather an early stage that has not yet been tested by responsibility or real-life demands. Nevertheless, an internal narrative may form in which crisis becomes sufficient justification to redefine the entire relationship, as if the presence of conflict automatically means that the outcome is already decided and that seeking an alternative is natural or inevitable. In this way, the crisis is transformed from a potential opportunity for understanding and repair into a psychological excuse for emotional withdrawal, while maintaining the belief that the decision was not fully chosen, but rather imposed by an unstable situation. Ultimately, this interpretation remains one of the most common, as it provides a sense of neutrality and reduced responsibility, even though the roots of the issue are often far deeper and more complex than this simplified description suggests. The fourth method, he doesn't care about me. The phrase, he doesn't care about me, is one of the most frequently used complaints when emotional distance begins to appear within a relationship. In this perspective, married life is reduced to a few limited moments: silence after returning from work, a lack of conversation, or the absence of simple daily questions, all of which are interpreted as signs of emotional neglect. In this narrative, everyday details become the only standard for measuring love. If the husband returns home exhausted after long working hours and chooses silence or rest instead of conversation, it is perceived as indifference or emotional coldness rather than a natural result of fatigue or psychological pressure. Meanwhile, an idealized image is formed of another person who appears more present, more attentive, and more willing to listen. This impression is often not the result of a fundamental difference in personality, but rather of the nature of early-stage interactions, where full attention is available and life is not yet burdened by responsibilities or complex obligations. However, with time, even these new relationships undergo the same transformation. Initial excitement fades, and intense attention gradually decreases as real-life conditions set in. Yet this reality is not always visible at the beginning, as the phase of infatuation makes everything appear more stable and appealing than it actually is. In this context, a man's natural need for silence or solitude after a long day is sometimes interpreted as emotional absence, while continuous listening in a new relationship is seen as clear proof of genuine care, despite the very different circumstances in each case. Thus, an unbalanced comparison is formed between a long-term relationship carrying the weight of daily life in all its complexity and a relatively new connection that has not yet been tested by reality. Ultimately, the idea of "he doesn't care about me" becomes a comforting internal explanation that reshapes the emotional experience in a way that places full responsibility for the distance on the partner, while overlooking the natural complexities that any long-term relationship inevitably goes through. The fifth method, there is no intimacy between us. This argument emerges when physical and emotional distance begins to increase within a marital relationship, where the situation is reduced to a single phrase: "We have become like roommates." Complaints then follow about the lack of physical closeness or emotional warmth, with the belief that the relationship has lost its natural intimacy. Within this framework, the absence of intimacy is interpreted as direct evidence of a lack of love or emotional fulfillment, as if physical closeness were the sole indicator of whether a relationship is successful or failing. However, reality is usually far more complex than that. The distance that develops between partners rarely comes from one side alone. Rather, it is the result of a long interaction between multiple factors: daily stress, emotional exhaustion, accumulated minor conflicts, or weakened emotional communication that precedes physical withdrawal. In many cases, the withdrawal does not happen suddenly, but gradually through small signals: reduced initiative, increased criticism, or a lack of positive emotional expression. Over time, these accumulations turn into emotional coldness that is later interpreted as loss of love, even though it is actually the result of a prolonged process of mutual distancing. Meanwhile, a new person may appear who seems more open to closeness and more attentive to emotional and physical needs in the early stages of the relationship. However, this impression is often tied to the beginning phase itself, where each person is still presenting their best self before the complexities of real life emerge. Nevertheless, an internal narrative may form that attributes the entire problem to one partner, as if the lack of intimacy were solely the result of that person's failure, while ignoring the full context that led to the situation. In this way, the phrase "there is no intimacy between us" becomes a broad explanation used to redefine the entire relationship, rather than recognizing it as a symptom of a deeper issue that requires understanding, communication, and reconstruction, not merely a comparison between a complicated present and an idealized beginning. The seventh method, "it just happened this way," the most complex justification. In this type of interpretation, Events are presented as a series of unplanned coincidences that gradually spiraled out of control. The story usually begins with a simple statement: there was no intention, we were just talking, supporting each other, and then things developed in a way I still don't fully understand. In this framing, the situation is portrayed as something that occurred outside the scope of personal control, as if it were the result of external circumstances rather than a sequence of accumulated choices. The narrative shifts from a conscious act to an emotional accident that happened suddenly and unexpectedly. However, when examined more closely, major emotional transitions are rarely the result of a single moment. They usually begin with very small details: frequent communication, shared emotional space, unclear boundaries, and a gradual evolution of the relationship over time. Yet these details are later reinterpreted within the personal narrative as ordinary events, messages that were just coincidences, meetings that were casual, conversations that were innocent, while the broader context that connected them into a continuous path is often overlooked. Here, a well-known psychological mechanism becomes visible, reducing the sense of responsibility by reconstructing the story in a way that minimizes personal choice and emphasizes coincidence or circumstance. In this framework, the person is no longer an active agent in the story, but rather a passive participant, as if events were happening to them rather than through their decisions. The paradox, however, is that this type of explanation often continues even after the full picture becomes clear, with a persistent insistence that it just happened, despite evidence suggesting a long process of gradual progression and accumulation. Ultimately, this justification does not simply reflect denial of events, but rather a deeper psychological need to redefine responsibility in a way that makes the experience less conflicting with one's self-image and more psychologically tolerable. The sixth method: I deserve to be happy. This argument emerges when an internal feeling of dissatisfaction transforms into a broader philosophical idea centered around deservingness. At this stage, the issue is no longer a simple evaluation of the relationship, but an internal conviction that I have the right to live a life that fulfills me, and if that is not happening, then a radical change is justified. Here, the relationship is no longer seen merely as a mutual commitment, but is reframed as a space that must provide complete emotional fulfillment. When this sense is missing, the focus shifts away from behavior or expectations and toward the belief that there is a fundamental lack in the experience itself. Over time, this mindset can evolve into an internal justification for any new step, where decisions are presented as a journey toward the self, or a pursuit of true happiness, rather than an acknowledgement of the real complexities involved, such as the other partner, shared responsibilities, and the consequences of choices for everyone involved. What is often overlooked, however, is that the idea of deserved happiness is not a fixed state that can be permanently achieved. It is a fluid concept shaped by internal awareness and evolving expectations. When it is built on constant comparison or idealized standards, it can easily turn into an endless cycle of searching for a better experience without ever reaching lasting stability. Through long-term observation of human behavior, a clear psychological truth can be noticed. Human beings naturally tend to protect their self-image, even when making difficult or painful decisions. Rather than confronting mistakes directly, the mind reshapes experience in a way that makes responsibility feel lighter and events easier to justify and live with. In this context, decisions are not presented as fully conscious choices, but rather interpreted as responses to external circumstances, misunderstandings, lack of communication, emotional pressure, or feelings of dissatisfaction. This psychological mechanism is not tied to a specific group of people. It is a general human tendency that appears when actions conflict with internal values or the self-image a person wishes to maintain. When this contradiction occurs, the mind begins searching for explanations that allow the individual to remain consistent with their principles in their own eyes, even if reality is far more complex. The language of justification in relationships. In romantic relationships in particular, this mechanism becomes more visible. Phrases such as "I am not understood," "the relationship has changed," or "we are going through a difficult phase" are not necessarily final judgments about the relationship itself, but rather internal attempts to interpret a state of emotional dissatisfaction or confusion. With repeated use of this type of thinking, a person may begin to build their own narrative, interpreting events in a way that reduces their sense of responsibility and increases the feeling that they are acting for valid reasons. However, in reality, human relationships are far too complex to be reduced to a single person or a single cause. They are the result of a long interaction between two individuals involving communication, neglect, pressure, and often unbalanced expectations. How should this stage be understood? When repeated complaints appear within a relationship, it is not wise to view them as certain signs of an inevitable ending, but rather as signals of a communication breakdown or an imbalance in expectations. At this stage, the real solution is often direct and honest conversation, and an attempt to understand what is happening instead of jumping to final conclusions. In some cases, the truth may be simple but painful. The relationship either needs genuine rebuilding or a clear and respectful ending, rather than remaining in a state of ambiguity and emotional exhaustion. The core idea is not to accuse one side or absolve the other, but to understand how the human mind works when trying to reconcile reality, emotions, and decisions. Every person, in moments of emotional tension, may reshape their story in a way that allows them to continue moving forward, even if it comes at the cost of complete accuracy in interpreting what actually happened.